So the big question is this. We know spontaneous remissions and so-called miracle cures exist. We also know they aren't so spontaneous after all. I'm living proof of this, having cured my quote-unquote incurable illness. There's something to how this happens. So how do we, as humans with chronic symptoms, tap into this so-called miraculous healing capacity? That is the question, and this podcast will give you the answers. My name is Dr. Erin Hayford, and welcome to the Sacred Illness Podcast. Before we begin today's episode, just my standard medical disclaimer. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The content should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional regarding any medical concerns. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Sacred Illness Podcast. I was inspired to record this episode today by a conversation I had with a client. He and I were talking about DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder, something we used to call multiple personality disorder. This is a way that a person has learned how to cope with stress and trauma, where they will switch into a different identity, also known as an alter. This person that they switch into can be completely different. They can have a different voice, they have a different persona, they have different thoughts and feelings. What my client was saying was he was quoting something that I think he had read, which is that these different personalities can have different medical diagnoses. So I wanted to look into it more deeply. And so I was doing a lot of research on that, and I just found how fascinating this is. I think it's really pertinent to this mind-body work that I do and all the things I talk about on this podcast, because if ever we needed evidence of the impact of the mind on the body, DID is a really beautiful example of this, because within the same person, a person can carry completely different physical conditions depending on which alter shows up. I'm talking about changes to vision, allergies, even paralysis and blindness. One person might be blind and then another alter comes online and they have perfect vision. These are actually documented cases in peer-reviewed research. And so it really forces us to ask how much of illness is in the body and how much of it is actually in the mind, which of course is what my work is all about. So I wanted to talk about some of these cases. One of the first recorded cases of DID in the United States goes all the way back to 1811. It was a woman named Mary Reynolds. And in one of the alters that she would move into, she was both blind and deaf. In another alter, her senses worked totally fine. Around the same time, there was another case study of a young girl named Estelle. She lived in France. She had leg paralysis in one of her alters, but was able to walk in another. And so there was this really interesting overlap between identity and illness, where both seem to shift depending on the mind. Essentially, they would shift with the state of mind. If we then fast forward to more modern psychiatry, in the 1980s, researchers began to systematically document DID patients and look at the condition itself, but then also as a result of that would see the physical changes that happened as people moved in and out of their different alters. So in one case, there was this study where a woman was allergic to citrus juice, but only in one persona. When she would switch into other ones, that allergy was completely absent. And then another woman had a cat allergy, was not present in other alters. Then there was this larger study done at the National Institute of Mental Health, and they looked at 100 DID patients. 26% of them had personality-specific allergic responses. More than a third of them had different reactions to different foods. So their alters had different reactions to foods. One might be allergic to one thing, and another would have a different reaction. And nearly half of the people in this study responded differently to medications. One person might take a drug and be totally sedated by it, but then another alter within the same person would be completely immune, like it wouldn't impact them at all. And so it's as if each self brought its own immune system or its own metabolism or its own response to things online, to things coming into the body. They would respond differently to them depending on what alter they were in. The vision stories in the research were some of the most dramatic examples of this impact of the mind on the body. In the late 1980s, ophthalmologists were testing DID patients' eyesight across their different alters, and they found measurable clinical differences in the alters that these people would move into. One identity might need glasses, whereas another identity within the same person had perfect visual acuity. Sometimes eye muscles would align in one and drift in another. There's this one case of the woman who lived in Germany. Some of her alters were completely blind. She was not pretending to be blind. There was no electrical response to light, whereas the other identities she would move into in the same body saw completely normally. And the kicker is that she could switch between these personalities within seconds, sight on, sight off, as if her brain was gating vision itself. And even more stunning is as therapy progressed and her alters began to integrate, her blindness lifted. So that stopped happening in her as she integrated these parts of self. And then other systems that are impacted by folks with DID are their handedness. So some alters can be right-handed, others can be left-handed, some stutter, others don't. One identity might be sensitive to pain, another might be totally numb to pain. There was even a case where a woman's 7 different alters each had their own type of headache. One had a migraine, another had a tension headache, another had a cluster headache. And then there were also people who had seizure-like episodes. Some alters would have convulsions. Others within the same person never did have seizures. And medical tests, again, would confirm that they're not faked. They were true psychophysiological events. The testing all backed up the reality that these things were truly happening in these different personas, but not in the other alters within the same body. So then again, if we move a little bit more modernly, in 1990, researchers measured the autonomic nervous system of DID patients. This would include things like heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductance, so temperature and sweating. And what they found was that each alter carried a distinct baseline pattern. So one identity might consistently run a high blood pressure and faster heart rate. Another one might have low arousal in the system, so very little activation. But that means the nervous system itself, the wiring of fight, flight, rest, digest, shifted with identity, which is really at the root of all the things we're talking about. If we zoom out and think about what this means about illness, there's no verified case where one alter has cancer and the other doesn't, because it's important to remember that the cells in a body are the same. It's not like they're switching bodies. It's still the same cellular makeup. But what these studies all point to is that there's countless cases where perception, expression, and even measurable physiology differ dramatically across alters. Allergies, eyesight, muscle tone, pain thresholds, even sleep apnea showed up in some studies where some had it and some didn't. So it doesn't mean that the illness is imaginary. It means that the mind's influence on the body runs far deeper than we usually allow ourselves to believe or to understand. And DID is really, again, just a beautiful example and a dramatic example of something that we all experience in similar ways. How stress changes our digestion, our anxiety will tighten our chest, joy allows us to relax. And so there's a helpful analogy here. If we think about the body having 2 clocks, cells don't just magically change when an alter switches, right? So a person can't just have cancer and then not. We can't just toggle that on and off in an instant. Chronic illness, tumor growth, autoimmune disease, metabolic dysfunction, these operate on the body's slow clock. These are conditions that form over weeks, months, and years, and they are shaped by many different changing forces, the biggest being the nervous system function that I talk about here on the podcast. Then there's also the fast clock. This is what the brain and the nervous system are altering and modulating within seconds to minutes. This would be blood pressure that can fall or rise in a heartbeat. Pain sensitivity can be dialed up or down with the brainstem signals that are sent. Vision can sharpen, blur, or even switch off in the case of that woman who is blind if the cortex closes the gate. Allergies can flare or fade depending on nervous system tone and how it's signaling the immune system acutely in the moment. Stress chemistry can surge or calm, changing our blood sugar, our gut motility, and our inflammation. So that's why in DID, we see allergies appearing and disappearing, headaches appearing and disappearing, vision toggling on and off. The fast clock in those folks is running the show. These are physiological changes we can see flipped on and flipped off depending on who the persona is and what their nervous system is signaling. So here's the crucial part. When the fast clock fires the same pattern often enough over and over, Eventually, the slow clock learns it. States become traits. So repeated stress resets baselines like heart rate, blood pressure, inflammation, frequent immune flares, frequent pings to that acute immune response begins to bias the immune system toward hyperreactivity. Chronic adrenaline pulses changes insulin sensitivity, appetite, neural pathways over time begin to wire more strongly into whatever it is they're rehearsing, whether it's hypervigilance or calm. And then over time, even gene expression begins to get flipped on and bend to the pattern that the body is continuing to express. So again, while we can't just switch on, switch off cancer, we can rehearse different states of physiology over time. And those rehearsals repeated daily, season after season, become the architecture of our long-term health. So DID is really this, again, example of this truth. It shows us in very stark contrast how identity, belief, and nervous system regulation or lack thereof can flip immediately modifiable systems. It has that instantaneous influence. And it suggests something hopeful for all of us. If it can alter blood pressure in seconds, then practicing calm states daily can retrain our cardiovascular tone over months. If pain sensitivity can shift between alters, between personality states, then steady safety practices can lower chronic pain set points. If our vision can sharpen or blur, depending on cortical gating, then our nervous system regulation can ease headaches or eye strain or even vision in the long run. And if allergies can flare in one alter but not another, then tending to stress and vagal tone can reduce reactivity across seasons. So none of this is saying it's all in your head. It's saying your head is in your body, which is wired into every single cell. And because it's wired, it's trainable. So the real invitation here is to, as always, tune into what is wired in me, what is programmed in me, what is running the show, what stories am I telling myself, how am I responding to things. What I think is really fascinating and what the research didn't get into is thinking about each of those alters that people would move into. How did they see the world? How are they living in their body and in the world that created those responses to those specific things? Like, why was that one woman, one part of her was allergic to citrus juice and another part not? What was it about orange juice that caused her body to see it as an invader, as an enemy? So that part of her, that alter part of her, responds negatively to it where others don't. I think that's where we need to see that nuance. If we can switch it on and off, if we can change these fast clocks on and off like that, then it tells us that initially there's some impulse coming into the system that is flipping on some switch because of how we are perceiving it, because of what it reminds us of, because of what it's related to, what it's connected to. That's the really important thing. So if we have some trauma around orange juice and it flips this switch on and we get allergic to it, and then we leave that switch on and we never work on what that thing is, eventually that starts to move into the slow clock. It starts to get into those deeper cellular patterns that leads to chronic illness. So those quick levers that we can work on, altering our breathing, working on boundaries, creating safety in our lives, working on meaning shifts, understanding how we're perceiving things and what we're thinking. That's how we start to change our state in the moment. And then, of course, that deeper, longer work is to get into what are those programs in the first place that are telling me I'm not safe. But as we repeat those safety cues over and over, and as we work to reprogram those stories in our nervous system, those repeated states start to train the slow clock, which then impacts your cells, your tissue, and your physiology. So what DID really shows us is that all of us live this reality every single day. Our personality, the stories we're telling ourselves, our beliefs, and our nervous system programming conducts the body's music. It's like the conductor of this entire symphony that is our body. And if we change the cues often enough, the whole score changes for better or worse. And so we need to be more mindful of what is that conductor saying to the system? How do we begin to influence that fast clock to eventually influence the slow clock, and know that it's never too late because the body is constantly turning over its cellular makeup every single day. Cells are turning over, healing, dying away, new ones are being born. So we can begin to literally wire and become new as our bodies heal. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. I hope that was fascinating for you as it was for me. And until next time, I'll see you then. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Sacred Illness Podcast. If you find this information shared here inspirational and educational, please share it with those you think would benefit from this work. To take this work deeper yourself, check out our website, www.aurorasomatic.com, where you can explore our coaching, community, and course options. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel where new content is coming out all the time, intended to inspire, awaken, and help you deepen your relationship with yourself, your life, and your world. We'll see you next time.